Tonight, is Anthony Albanese ready to be Australia's next Prime Minister? He's in the fight of his political life and he's standing by to take your questions. Welcome to Q&A. Hello, I'm David Spears. We're coming to you live from Eugene Goosens Hall in Sydney tonight. My guest this evening is the Opposition Leader, Anthony Albanese. Please make him feel very welcome. It's great to have so many of you here with us tonight. Each week our audience is made up of 1/4 coalition voters, 1/4 Labor, 1/4 representing minor parties and independents, and 1/4 undecided, and tonight is no different. We'll get to as many of your questions as possible, and a little later, Sammy J will be here live for his comedic take on how to vote. And remember, you can stream us on iView, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Quanda is the hashtag. Please get involved. Our first question tonight comes from Brent Martin.
This election, I, like many other young Australians, are desperate for a leader with a bold, daring vision for our country. Someone who has the guts to tackle the very real, very big challenges that our nation is facing. Instead, you've offered a meek smattering of small target policies which fall far short of the action needed for meaningful change. And I guess it seems like this election, the choice is between the Liberals, who you argue will make things worse, and Labor, who from their policy offerings aren't interested in making things better. So I guess I'm wondering what hope there is for those of us who feel as though we're on the Titanic and the two major political parties in this country are arguing over who gets to rearrange the deck chairs.
Well, thanks very much for the question. And with respect, I think we are putting forward a very serious offering at this election of a better future. We have a serious plan for climate change that will see by 2030, 82% of the national energy market be renewables. That will reduce emissions by 43%, will create 604,000 jobs, including, of course, new industries that will emerge while we're doing so. That will create $52 billion of private sector investment. We see that as a major driver of productivity and economic reform. And together with that, we have a National Reconstruction Fund to support new industries, to support existing industries to transform as well. And we want to train Australians to fill those jobs of the future. By creating Jobs and Skills Australia, we'll have 465,000 fee-free TAFE places, 20,000 additional university places. We have a plan for cheaper childcare, a plan for cheaper electricity. We have a plan to make more things here using that National Reconstruction Fund. And we have plans including recognising First Nations people through constitutional change and a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament. We have comprehensive plans to deal with the challenges that we have at the moment. The alternative is 3 more years of drift, 3 more years of a Prime Minister who says it's not my job to solve the big challenges that Australia is facing. You're right to identify them. They are big. We have practical plans that are implementable in our first term.
To Brent's question, though, I mean, Labor is taking a more limited policy offering to this election than 3 years ago. Is it possible you've underestimated the appetite for reform coming out of the pandemic?
What we've done is to identify 2 things, David. One is the pandemic showed us the strength of Australian society. There is that sense whereby people have made sacrifices. People have been magnificent over the last couple of years. But it's also shown the weaknesses in the economy. It's also shown circumstances whereby I think people want a clear path of change. They don't want everything upended, but they want to see that change and reform come. And if in 3 years' time I'm on this program asking to be re-elected, and we have cheaper childcare, we have greater women's participation in the workforce, we have a National Reconstruction Fund that's creating those new industries, we're addressing the challenge of climate change, we have more secure work, then I think that is an ambitious agenda, but it's one that is practical, one that's achievable, and I've been very cautious
to
not promise things that can't be delivered.
So what's practical, what's achievable? I mean, is the reality that it has, in your view, become harder in modern politics to even propose serious reforms if it means one group of society is going to be worse off, even if it is for the national good? Is it too hard to do that now?
I believe it's still possible. I think, for example, on climate, people want to end the climate wars. People are sick of the debate. And you have a policy that's been announced by us that's supported not just by the trade union movement, but the Business Council of Australia, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry that I addressed today, Australian Industry Group and the National Farmers Federation. People do want solutions. People
but it's not as ambitious as last.
Get away.
That's
and as well, I think people have conflict fatigue. People are sick of the arguments that have really dominated politics for a considerable period of time. We had prime ministers changing. We had a government elected last time essentially campaigning on not being us, campaigning against Labor. And this time again, you've had a government that struggles with the present but has no plan for the future. Even their cost of living measures, they all end once people have cast their vote. Now, we have a plan for the future beyond that, to grow productivity, to grow the economy, to grow opportunity. And I think that there are very stark differences between the major parties at this election.
Well, just, Brent, quickly back to you. Are these big ideas enough for you?
It's all just a bit of spin, right? I mean, your shared equity house buying scheme does nothing to address the underlying issues affecting the skyrocketing price of home ownership. Your climate policy doesn't do enough to reduce emissions at a rate which is necessary to avoid global catastrophe. Your border protection policy doesn't do anything to even look at the cost, not just in terms of fiscal cost, but the cost of human life, of offshore detention and boat turnbacks.
Well, Brent, our shared equity scheme, for example, is just one of our housing policies. We have a Housing Australia Future Fund. We're going to invest in social housing. I grew up in public housing. I know the importance of having a secure roof over your head can make to your life. And one of the things that I often say is that I know the difference that government can make to people's lives because I've lived it. That's my story. The son of a single mum who was an invalid pensioner, crippled up with rheumatoid arthritis, who grew up in public housing not far from here on Pyrmont Bridge Road. And I've been able to aspire now to be Prime Minister of the country. We'll create, in terms of housing, 20,000 additional social housing units, 10,000 affordable housing dwellings for essential workers. We have an emergency housing fund. Tonight, like every night, women and children will be turned away from shelters because there just aren't spaces. So they'll sleep in their car, they'll sleep in a park, or worse still, they'll go back to a dangerous situation. These are all serious policies that will make a difference.
We've got a bit more on housing coming up in a later question. I want to go to our next one, though, because this video question comes from Raymond Webb.
Good evening, Mr Albanese. My concerns with you as potential Prime Minister are your credentials. You have never held a portfolio for finance, foreign affairs, education or health, all critical areas for a successful Australian economy and long-term well-being. How can we be confident that you have the experience to manage these critical areas? Should we just simply take the risk?
Well, thanks very much for the question, Raymond. If I'm elected Prime Minister, I will be the fourth time. That will be the fourth time that Labor has won government from opposition since the Second World War. The other three people, Gough Whitlam, Bob Hawke, and Kevin Rudd, none of them had served as ministers in a government. I have served for 6 years as a cabinet minister and government leader in the House of Representatives, including as infrastructure minister, regional development, local government, communications, and transport ministries, the digital economy, other portfolios I've held over a long period of time. I've served as Deputy Prime Minister. I've served as Acting Prime Minister on a couple of occasions. Now, I will lead also the most experienced Labor team of any Labor government since Federation coming into government. And I make this point to you, David, that there's been a fair bit thrown at me during this campaign, and I expect a fair bit more to come in the next couple of weeks. There hasn't been one glove laid on anything I did for 6 years as Infrastructure Minister with a budget in excess of $65 billion, the transport reform that I undertook, the communications, when I was Communications Minister, when we were rolling out fibre-based national broadband network.
That's true, but I think Raymond's point is, you were in Parliament and on the front bench a lot longer than all those other previous Labor Prime Ministers you mentioned, but for more than 12 years in government and opposition, you're stuck with infrastructure. You didn't think to expand your experience into Treasury, health, finance, education.
Well, before then, I was the Shadow Minister for Employment Services and Training. I was the Shadow Minister for Ageing and Seniors. I was the Shadow Minister who wrote the renewable energy target for employment, for environment and climate change. I had federal portfolios as well in Indigenous affairs, in the arts. One of the really weird things I think about some of the government's position that's put forward is that somehow infrastructure isn't an economic portfolio. It absolutely is.
It's important, but it's a long time, you must admit, to spend in one role, more than 12 years.
But I did infrastructure, and at the end of the government, at the end of our period in government, I was Deputy Prime Minister, I was Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, I was Minister for Communications and Digital Economy, and I was Leader of the government in the House of Representatives.
You had a bit going
in a minority parliament. And when I was Leader of the House in a minority government, we got 595 pieces of legislation through. We didn't just occupy the space. We did paid parental leave during that period. We did serious reform, including the National Disability Insurance Scheme. We did serious reform that helped to change the country. And as I said, not one criticism from the government, none of the rorts and wastes that we've seen from this government that just occupies the space and doesn't actually change the country for the better.
Let's get to our next question. It's a video from Kathleen Campbell.
Mr Albanese, you've shared the story about being raised by a strong single mum. I'm a strong single mum too, looking after 2 kids with neurodiverse conditions and complex trauma needs coming from the foster care system. My question is about NDIS agility and what you'll do to remove the bureaucratic nightmare that exists for parents like me. I can't get anything done and I'm thinking about quitting my job just so I can be the full-time carer to the kids. It shouldn't be this difficult and I'd love to know what you're going to do about it. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Kathleen, and thanks for what you do for those 2 young children. Our foster carers are some of the best people in this country. They do amazing work, and thank you. Can I say this, that we do have a plan to return the National Disability Insurance Scheme back to its original objectives. And the problem is that people have been forgotten. They've been taken out of the equation. So many people have had their funding cut, and we will stop the cuts, we'll stop the waste, we'll improve efficiencies, we will respect the NDIS system by putting people back at the centre. Part of that is about making sure that the representation on the NDIS board and the advocacy groups get proper funding as well. And in addition to that, part of the problem is the NDIA have a restriction, a cap on their number of staff. One of the things we've done is we have said that we will take $3 billion of the waste that's there from a government that's obsessed with contracting out, obsessed with labour hire, and we'll take some of that funding and put it back into rebuilding the public service, including removing that cap on the NDIA so that you can actually talk to someone in the agency. At the moment, it is very bureaucratic. There are decisions being made that are causing great frustration.
So Kathleen's told us her son has an acquired brain injury. She has spent thousands of dollars trying to get an autism diagnosis. but because she doesn't have a particular label here, this is what's creating the problem. She's had to spend more time and money again applying for NDIS help. So in your plans, what's going to help Kathleen?
Getting rid of the bureaucracy so that the NDIA, the agency, actually has operations that treat people as human. We need to put the humans back into human services.
So getting rid of the bureaucracy or adding to the bureaucracy?
No, getting it so they can talk to real people. At the moment, one of the things that's happening is that people can't engage with the agency, and then the advocacy groups as well. We will double the funding for those people who do the advocacy work to make sure that people can manage their way through the system.
Look, you did have trouble today recalling your 6-point plan, and I think you've listed most of those 6 points in your answer tonight. You did say earlier in the campaign, when you stumbled, you would own it. Was that another mistake today?
No, it wasn't, David. No, it wasn't. It was one of the things that puts people off politics, I think, is the sort of gotcha game playing.
Sure, I mean, some people see it as a gotcha question. Other people want you to have the details. So there are mixed views on this.
Well, the essential point is that I've just run through the 6 points.
But you couldn't today was the point.
And
I'm just wondering if you
No, I
saw
wasn't
that as
given the opportunity. What I did today...
You were asked a few times.
What I did today, David, was to say that the essential point, all of those points come down to one key fact, which is putting people back at the centre of the NDIS. That's the key element here. And I understand. I mean, I know the difference as my mum struggling to try and get things like, poles and things to help her get into the bath to get around. My mum couldn't use a knife and fork. She had crippled up her hands, her feet, all of that. There wasn't an NDIS. The idea of trying to get that assistance.
I don't doubt you understand.
So we need...
But I'm just wanting to clarify here, when today, and it's been all over the news tonight, you were asked what the 6 points are, you didn't know, someone gives you a folder, you read it out. Are you saying you didn't know? You did know off the top of your head?
Well, I said the point here, David, isn't some bureaucratic gotcha game. The point here is putting people back in charge of the NDIS and at the centre of it. And one of the things I reckon that really alienates people from the political system completely is this idea that politics is about a sort of series of gotchas and a game playing. What we're about
Look, some people agree with you on that.
Is a real impact on real people, And there are a range of measures that we will take in terms of the NDIS. Labor will always defend the NDIS and always protect it because it's an important part of our legacy. It's too important for games.
Let's go to our next question. It comes from Rohit Cole.
With regards to RBA forecasting a 6% headline inflation for the rest of the year and multiple interest rates expected in coming months, how is Labor government going to handle increased cost of living and any possible measures to reduce impacts of inflation and the rising interest rates?
We have practical plans. Thank you for your question. I know that a lot of people are really doing it tough out there. What we have is a triple whammy of wages that are going backwards in real terms, inflation that's up to 5.1%, and now interest rates that have gone up just this week. But the Reserve Bank has indicated that that's the first of a number of increases that will occur between now and the end of the year. So we need a plan that's beyond just the election. The government have one-off payments that end as soon as people have voted. We voted for them because we understand people are under pressure. But we need more than that. That's why our plan for cheaper childcare, our plan for cheaper medicines, our plan for cheaper electricity will make a difference to people's lives. But we also need economic growth which boosts productivity and boosts, therefore, the only way that you can have increased wages to take pressure off and increased business profitability as if you're targeting productivity. And that's why in the measures we've put forward at this election, in particular to name just one for brevity of time, our childcare policy, yes, it will help 96% of families will be better off, but it's also about boosting workforce participation, boosting productivity, and producing a return through that increased economic activity which is there.
But all of these measures, including childcare, about putting more money into people's pockets, into the economy. Rohit's asking about how to put downward pressure on inflation. Don't you need to reduce
That's how you
spending?
put downward pressure on inflation.
By spending more?
By having your spending targeted to areas that increase productivity.
But you're doing that on top of all the things the government's doing. So you're giving a tick to deeming rates, you're giving a tick to cheaper medicines, a tick to stage 3 tax cuts, a tick to every spending measure they've announced during the budget, all the handouts, and the extra measures that you've announced, including the childcare. Don't we need to reduce spending to put downward pressure on inflation?
What we need to do is to make sure that the spending is targeted towards increasing productivity. That's how you put downward pressure on inflation. And that's why our plans, whether it's childcare, which is our largest on-budget commitment during this election campaign, will do that.
But is all of this spending really going to put increase productivity?
Well, absolutely. That's why the Business Council and the entire business community, as well as every economist in the country, agrees that if you invest in childcare, what you do...
On that, but not all the spending. Plenty of them today are saying whoever's in government needs to reduce spending. We've got big pressures building in aged care and NDIS, defence, on top of all the money that's going out the door in this election campaign. When will this reckless spending stop, to quote Kevin Rudd?
Well, you need to be cautious in your spending, David, and one of the things that we will do...
Where's your caution?
We will do... Well, we've been cautious by targeting, if you look at where our expenditure is, whether it's childcare, whether it's our Powering Australia plan, they're measured, they're aimed at boosting, lifting productivity,
My point is that's not all you're doing,
economic activity.
You're also waving through everything the government's doing.
Well, what we will do, and we've said that Treasury and Finance will have an audit, line by line, to get rid of the government waste which is there. We don't even know, David, the number of funds that they established, essentially to then have political decisions based upon their colour-coded sheets. That's not how...
So if that audit finds that there's a grant that is political, is a rort or a waste, are you willing to cancel grants that have already been committed?
Well, if a government makes a commitment during an election campaign, there's no way that is automatically binding, and that is what they have done.
So some grants to community groups could be cancelled?
They've established they will be viewed on their merits, David. But if during an election campaign, just as commitments that Labor are making, the government, I'm sure, doesn't feel bound by. The problem here is, when I was a minister, we established Infrastructure Australia that directed infrastructure towards the best use. So you had, for example, more money committed to urban public transport than all previous governments
let's talk about now
in 107 years.
Let's talk about now.
That's the point, David.
What about the stage 3 tax cuts? Couldn't you at least say, we'll do it when we're in surplus, so we're not borrowing
It's been
money.
legislated, David.
Yeah, but if you're in government, you can undo that.
It's been legislated.
They haven't hit people's pockets yet.
It's been legislated. The people who voted for it, we tried.
You can change that.
We tried to amend it.
We're now in inflation we're told by the Reserve Bank Governor, interest rates are going to keep on climbing. Don't you need to rethink these things?
One of the things that people are crying out for, whether it's business or individuals as well, is certainty. Those tax cuts were passed by the Parliament.
In a different era.
They were passed by the Parliament. At the time, we said they were premature because they were a number of years in advance, but we've made it very clear that we have no intention to change any of those policies.
What about some revenue then? Can you find some revenue from somewhere?
Well, we've already announced our one tax measure, which is on multinationals to make sure...
Raised $2 billion over 40 years.
To make sure that they pay their fair share.
Okay, but you've got tens of billions of dollars coming in expenses on aged care, NDIS, defence. You raised $2 billion over 4 years.
And we have a plan for growth, David. We have a plan for growth through our Powering Australia plan, through our National Reconstruction Fund, through our childcare measures, through our housing measures. We have a plan to grow the economy, a plan to make sure that people aren't left behind, in terms of the people who are doing it really tough at the moment. And we accept that the cost of living, the price of everything's going up, but people's wages aren't. One of the things that we need to do is to have a policy that actually lifts wages. This government...
Well, you talk about people doing it tough.
This government say that low wage growth is a key feature of their economic architecture. It's not bad luck that wages have been constrained, it's bad policy.
Well, you mentioned people doing it tough. That brings us to our next question, which comes from Andrew Semler.
So, this is quite an emotive thing to vocalise, but there's every chance in 4 weeks I could be homeless, along with my teenage daughter. For the last 4 to 6 weeks, I have attended 7 to 8 property viewings per week, and I've personally witnessed bidding wars between potential tenants and agents. I've seen agents not turn up at all, and 80% of these viewings are being held during the workday, which you then need to apply for time off work. When you attend that many, you need a very understanding employer, which thankfully I have. And my question to you, Anthony, is what do you have in mind to help in particular renters, and what alternatives do you have once NRAS runs out?
Now, some support for that question. NRAS, I should explain, is the National Rental Affordability Scheme. It was introduced back in 2008, basically to give developers an incentive to offer some units at below market rent, below 20% below market rates for low-income earners. But it was for 10 years and it's gradually phasing out, which means people like Andrew are on the hunt for somewhere they can afford to live. Now, at the last election, Labor promised to reintroduce something similar. What are you offering this time?
Yeah. What we're offering is our Housing Australia Future Fund. That's about building additional social housing, but it's also about affordable housing for essential workers. That is not social housing, working with community housing groups, working potentially with superannuation funds. I think there's a great deal of potential for that to be expanded.
So if you're not an essential worker, you might expand it to someone like Andrew?
Absolutely. So there are, for example, some of the super funds are doing this now for essential workers, and there's examples in local government in some areas as well, working with developers so that you get better outcomes, so that you get a portion of any new development. For example, you might be a 3-storey development, you get an extra storey on top if it's then made available for affordable housing, so that people can get into housing.
Are you going to do that?
Housing. We're going to examine all of that, absolutely. Okay. We have a range of policies that we've announced already out there for social housing, emergency housing, affordable housing, and for our plan in terms of shared equity. That's also about taking people who can't possibly get into home ownership and giving them a foot in the door of home ownership based upon schemes that work in Western Australia that's been operating for 30 years. In Victoria, in the trial, interestingly, 1 in every 6 of homes who participated in that trial, which started around about 2017, have actually then purchased additional equity.
I don't know if Andrew is quite up to buying a home at the moment, but it sounds like you might do more.
And as well, we will have a national homelessness strategy.
Okay.
We have emergency funding for housing as well, including a remote housing strategy. So we have a pretty comprehensive plan, but we recognise that this is one of the great challenges that Andrew is facing practically, but people right around the country are.
Our next question comes from Amanda Lambert.
Hi. My question's about aged care. As we know, it's a really big problem, and you have said that you are going to provide 24/7 registered nurses and put into place the findings of the Royal Commission. How are you going to do this? Where are you going to get the staff from? And are we going to then know how the money is actually spent and make it transparent? Because it certainly isn't now. We don't know whether the money that's being spent is being put into the meals of our residents and our vulnerable citizens, or whether it's lining the pockets of executives.
Thanks very much for the question. I know that this has been an issue that has grown in significance over a period of time as the crisis has got worse. I think the fact that the Aged Care Royal Commission interim report was titled with one word, neglect, is just shocking in Australia in 2022. So to go to the specifics of your question as well, yes, in terms of transparency, we need to make sure, and we will, mean that every provider has to provide information, transparency about every dollar and where it goes. Because we want to make sure that every dollar goes to better food, to better care, not into someone getting a new Ferrari or what have you. We want to make sure it goes to aged care residents. That's one of the plans we've put forward in terms of nutrition. We've got Maggie Beer and her foundation helping us in terms of nutrition and food and working out the plan, because that's part of it. One of the most shocking stories, I think, about that came through the Aged Care Royal Commission came through a number of times about food that was left over being scraped off plates, put into blenders and served up as puree for residents the next day. We can do better than that.
Amanda's asking too about where you're going to find the nurses to get to 24/7 registered nurses.
One of the things about that the Royal Commission found, and we've worked closely with the union, the Nurses and Midwifery Association, Federation, they a majority of nurses in aged care currently are working part-time, aren't full-time as well. They want more hours. They can't.
Will that be enough though? You'll have to bring some in from overseas.
We'll have to train some, and of course we know that the health sector for a while has relied upon people from overseas.
But to meet this commitment, you'll have to bring some in
coming in as well. Well, aged care nurses have been coming in, and nurses in general have been coming in.
You're talking about a new commitment. You'll have to bring some in from overseas.
Australia for some time. I should imagine that migration, just like in our health system in general, for nurses and doctors, that migration will be a part of it. But we've also provided for...
How many though? Because I'm just coming back to Amanda's specific question here.
We've also provided for 20,000 additional places in universities for areas of skill shortage. And in terms of registered nurses, that is an absolute priority there. But what we want to do is to take... These are all recommendations from the Royal Commission.
Well, just to be clear on that, the Royal Commission recommended 24/7 registered nurses from July 2024. You're promising when?
Well, we want to bring that forward. We want to bring it forward because we think that we want to bring it forward to next year.
So this means you're going to have to find them a lot faster than
we want to
the Commission
bring it forward.
Recommended. So just to be clear on Amanda's question, you will bring some in from overseas. I just want to be clear about this.
If we need to, we will.
And do you know how many?
If we need to, we will. But the first thing that we would do is use those nurses who also have left the system. One of the things that's happened is that because of the pressures in the aged care system, if you're a nurse or an aged care worker and you're working in a facility whereby these residents are your friends, they're like your family, and there are 4 buzzers going at once, and you've got to make a decision over where you will go to. I've spoken to nurses and aged care workers who've left the system. We have adopted as well 215 minutes of care. That's consistent with what the Aged Care Royal Commission has recommended. And also the issue of better pay for aged care workers. We'll make a submission to the Fair Work Commission saying that aged care workers need to be better paid. If not, we know they'll continue to leave the system. That's the point here, David. It's not a matter of whether you go keep the status quo or do something, because the status quo will mean you go backwards.
Okay.
Now, we're not pretending that these things can be done overnight. We are saying, though, that we need to deliver on it, and the current government haven't committed to 24/7 nurses at all.
Let's get to our next question. It comes from Laura Reynolds.
As a new Australian, I'll be voting for the first time in this election. Something that I notice about this campaign is the sheer number of independent candidates. Do you think this indicates a dissatisfaction with the two major parties?
Well, thanks very much, Laura, and good luck with your deliberations. The right to vote here in Australia is very important, that people participate in the democratic process regardless of who they vote for. Well, I think that there has been a change in society, that's the truth. And when I grew up, I came out of the womb as a believer with three great faiths, the Catholic Church, South Sydney Rugby League Football Club and the Australian Labor Party. And
I'm not sure which of those people are applauding, but continue.
all three, I hope. But although Souths are playing tonight and I'm missing it. In terms
that
of...
is a sacrifice.
That historical family base has broken down. Society is far more disparate than it was.
So is it society or the parties that's losing people here? Because I just want to go back to Laura. Can I just quickly, Laura, are you willing to tell us whether you've made up your mind in this election campaign yourself? Is it the major parties for you or one of these independents?
I'm close to making my mind up, but and policies are really important to me, obviously. But I think globally, trust has, especially in politicians, has been eroded. Certainly in my home country. And I'm really just looking for a candidate and a party who I know I can trust, who's for the people rather than for themselves. So yeah, policies are important, but also trust is really important.
And do you see that in the major parties?
Yes, yeah, in some candidates, certainly.
Right.
But...
Okay, well...
Well, I think it's fair to say as well that political discourse has changed. Even the way that this election is being conducted. You know, you get down to sound bites rather than philosophies and values of driving issues forward, you know, and that, I think, is helping to alienate people, helping to divide people into camps. I think social media can be problematic. It is difficult. I gave a major speech today at the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry about productivity, about how you grow the economy. I'm sure it won't be on the front page of the newspapers tomorrow, but it was a significant, serious contribution to policy development.
I'm glad we can have a meaty conversation about all of these policies tonight.
But so much of this campaign is not about that, unfortunately, and I think that presents some alienation. I think also the behaviour of the major political parties, I think the chopping and changing of leaders that we had, both sides were guilty of that, left open alienation on those issues. And in some areas as well, our parliament isn't functioning. There has been a majority of the House of Representatives and the Senate, I think if people had a vote, since at least 2007 for serious action on climate change. There was a period when it happened and then it got unwound. There's a majority support now, but
and we've heard that point.
There's something wrong with the democracy when Parliament isn't reflecting what the views of its members are, let alone the views of the general population.
I'm sorry to hurry you up, but I do want to get through as many questions as we can here tonight. Let's get to our next question, which comes from Sean Berry.
I'd like to ask if the federal ICAC will function retrospectively to investigate the current government's actions.
Well, thanks, Sean. I do think the reasons why we don't have a National Anti-Corruption Commission now are sitting behind Scott Morrison and his front bench. And I think that we need to restore, to go to the previous question as well. We're crying out to restore faith in our political system.
So will it be retrospective?
Now, I think the commission that we establish will be able to look at whatever it wants to. Part of the problem at the moment with the government's so-called model was that Cabinet would have to approve what's looked at.
So your
public
plan,
hearings,
do you want the actions of the current government looked at by your commission?
Well, that would be a decision for them. The whole point here, David, is that what I want is an independent system at arm's length from myself and from government that can look at any areas of corruption in the political system, in the bureaucracy, at any time.
And do you regard pork barrelling as corruption? Is pork barrelling corruption?
I think that some of the schemes that we have seen, when you have $30 million paid for a block of land that's worth $3 million, where you have programs where only government members or candidates can apply or even know these projects exist, and then they're announced, there's something wrong there.
Okay, but is pork barrelling corruption? Is pork barrelling corruption? Because both sides do it.
There is something wrong there. So I think that in terms of, look, commitments will be given by all political parties.
In marginal seats with our money.
But they should, one of the things that I did, well, I'll tell you what I did, David, as the minister responsible
let's look at what you're doing now.
Community infrastructure.
As leader of the opposition.
Well, this is the sort of thing that I would do. As the minister responsible for community infrastructure, as regional development, local government, all funding went through local government.
Okay, but now you're promising money for dog ovals and footy grounds in marginal seats at this election.
Well, we're making commitments across a range of electorates, both safe and marginal, at this election. That is true. And political parties have always made commitments during election campaigns. Okay. The question is here, what this government has done is establish funds as the government whereby there's no transparency, there's no proper processes as to what the outcome should be, and a massive distortion. When you have commuter car parks, David, promised where there's no train stations for the commuter to get out of their car and get on the train, then that's red hot, and this government has done it with billions and billions of dollars. They've done it in community safety, sports rorts,
we don't need the
regional
whole list.
grants,
Okay.
the full bit,
we know
and
about
it's
this.
red hot.
Okay. More of your questions in a moment. First, though, we would like to point out Q&A has extended a standing invitation to the Prime Minister to appear during the election campaign in this same format, a one-on-one, to answer your questions, as many as we can. That invitation has not yet been accepted, but we will keep asking.
Good luck with that, David, given the Prime Minister refused to have one of the 3 debates on the ABC, refuses to do Q&A, refuses to do insiders, and hasn't done the 7:30.
We'll take that as a comment, Anthony Albanese. All right, we've now got 5 quick-fire questions. The idea here is we're going to race through a bunch of questions, try and keep the answers as brief as we can, because, as I say, we want to get to as many as we can. To kick us off, a video from Melinda Davies.
The Coalition increased fees for students studying humanities at university. Whilst not diminishing the importance of STEM subjects, if you win power, will you decrease the fees for humanities subjects and therefore acknowledge the importance of humanities and education as a whole?
Brief answer to that one.
We will certainly value the humanities projects and indeed a general arts education.
Decrease the fees for humanities?
I'm not here to make budget commitments because
Labor was very critical of the
watching.
Government when it changed the funding, the fees for different courses, including humanities going up. Will you make them lower?
We will increase university funding. We have said that. But with regard to specifics, that is something that we would consider. Right. But we'd consider with the starting point being that education contributes not just to individuals, it actually contributes to a smarter country and contributes to all of us.
Our next question from Bob Maynard. Bob.
Mr Albanese, if you are elected, would you allow the Biloela family to return to the community in Queensland and to stay in Australia? Or are you concerned that those actions may trigger off some more people smuggling operations?
The answer to your question is yes. That family... That family are not a threat to anyone. That family, the dad was working at the local meatworks. We actually import labour to work at meatworks. The mum was Priya, was contributing at the local St Vincent de Paul. I've been to Biloela.
So
the community want them back, and they should return home to Biloela. Barnaby Joyce agrees with me, and so do people who actually have a look at what's required here. You can be strong on borders without being weak on humanity.
Keep this quick fire. Our next question's from Angus Talbot. Angus.
Mr Albanese, if your government was elected, would Australia get to see a referendum on Australia transitioning to become a republic?
Yes, that's something I support, but first, we need to recognise First Nations people in our constitution.
So does that mean no referendum on a republic in this coming term?
I think that's highly likely, because I think the idea that you change our head of state but still don't recognise that history didn't begin or end in 1788 is not tenable. We're diminished until we recognise that we live with the oldest continuous civilisation on the planet, and that is a great privilege.
Our next question is a video, and it comes from Olivia Jordan.
Would Mr Albanese, when a government seek to change the date of Australia Day and its significance and recognise the implications it has on our first Australians? What are your thoughts?
No, I have no intention of changing the date of Australia Day.
You've had some different positions on this over the years. You've advocated the two-date idea of January 25 to...
No, I haven't done that, David.
Well, you've certainly sympathised with that idea.
I haven't done that. What I've said, potentially one idea that I floated and I've discussed with First Nations people is
and
whether...
you no longer like that idea?
Is whether we have a referendum to recognise, to change the Constitution on that date. So that the idea there would be that you would recognise that history didn't begin then. It went back at least 65,000 years, but it didn't end then either.
Okay.
Modern Australia is made up of, with the exception of First Nations people, migrants and descendants of migrants in this country, and that might be an idea, all it was is an idea, that might be able to bring people together in a unifying way. One of the things that I would do as Prime Minister, David, is always look towards unifying the country wherever possible. I think we've had enough division and enough conflict.
You don't think January 26th Australia Day already divides Australians?
Quite clearly, it's an issue out there, but January 26 is an important historical day. I recognise it's a very difficult day, though.
So you won't move that?
For First Nations people, but I have no intention of changing that. The issue that I raised was around that. It was Noel Pearson who raised constructively the idea of having two dates, January 25 and January 26. I think we need to have these constructive discussions about how we move forward as a nation rather than have division over this.
Okay. Our next question comes from John Posinek.
Does the panel consider the Chinese presence in the Darwin port a threat to Australian security? If so, will Labor revoke the lease?
We've got a panel of one, so we'll keep it to you, Anthony Albanese. Will you revoke the lease on the Darwin port?
I was a member of Julia Gillard's government that proudly put US Marines in Darwin, and the current government sat back and watched while its coalition colleagues in Darwin sold the port to China.
Will you revoke the lease, is the question?
To China. Well, I would never have done it.
Will you revoke it, though?
I would never have done it in the first place.
John wants to know if you revoke it.
I know what he wants to know.
What's the answer?
But you can't make decisions which have legal implications on the show tonight. The truth is, though, that we would never have sold the port. We opposed it at the time and raised it. I was, as the infrastructure and transport...
So you'd take advice on that, basically?
We'd take advice on it. But clearly the idea that the Port of Darwin does not have national security and national implications for us is to my mind, quite obviously absurd. And I was surprised that it was just waved through in the way that it was.
Okay, well, that was our quickfire section. I'm not sure how quick some of those answers were, but we appreciate you giving it a go. Let's get to our next question, which comes from Chris Breen. Chris.
Under past Labor governments, defence funding was cut to 1.56% of the GDP. The Liberal government has raised it to over 2% of the GDP. With China expanding its influence in the Solomon Islands, how will a sudden change in government to a party that is traditionally light on defence spending help bolster foreign policy and mitigate the threat of China?
Well, thanks very much for the question. I lead a party that's the party of John Curtin. And at Australia's most dire need during World War II, our darkest hour, the country turned to Australia, not with an election, mid-term, to make John Curtin Prime Minister and to lead us during that period. The difference between the Howard government's defence expenditure and the expenditure over the period of the Rudd and Gillard governments was 0.03. That's the only difference that was there. We do face a strategic competition in the region. China is more forward-leading, it's more aggressive. And we've seen that with what has occurred in the Solomons. The Solomons is the greatest foreign policy failure that Australia has had in recent times. They just dropped the ball. We know that China is more aggressive and forward-leaning. What that means is that we do need increased defence expenditure, but increased defence expenditure, which I've committed to being above 2%, but whatever is necessary to defend our national interests, means defence capability. The problem with this government is that there's been expenditure that hasn't produced anything. $5.5 billion. $5.5 billion is more than our commitment on childcare. It is double what our commitment to fix aged care has been on budget. $5.5 billion with just a torn-up contract.
You did back the French submarine deal. You did back the nuclear submarine deal.
We do support the nuclear submarine deal.
So what were they meant to do?
This government had, be clear, this government had a deal that they were going to do with the Japanese first. Then they were going to do a deal with the French. Then, having cost $5.5 billion, they then...
So they should have stuck with it?
They then changed. No, David, we supported the arrangements that were made. But across a whole range of whether it's helicopters, whether it be other areas of the Navy, Air Force, etc., we've seen a whole lot of waste, failure to produce increased capability. As Greg Sheridan from The Australian said just this week, if defence announcements made us more secure, we would be the most secure nation on earth.
This question's come up a bit during the campaign. Let me just see if we can clear it up tonight. Who will be your Defence Minister?
Our Defence Shadow Minister, Brendan O'Connor, is doing a fantastic job. And my expectation...
You know that doesn't answer the question.
Well, my expectation, David, everyone hasn't been elected yet, and the caucus elect our front bench, as you're aware.
Sure, but you can tell us who the Treasurer is. You can tell us...
My starting point is that those people who have their existing portfolios will continue in those roles.
And just coming back to Chris's question, how to mitigate the threat of China. How do you mitigate the threat of China?
Well, the truth is that this is going to be a challenge whoever's in government. That's the truth. We live in an era of strategic competition between the United States and China, including in our region. And we have the same position as the government on Hong Kong, on Taiwan, on the Uyghurs, on the South China Sea, on those issues. I take the view that my friend Kurt Campbell, the US leading representative in the Indo-Pacific, speaks about competition without catastrophe. That has to be the objective here. The consequences of military conflict, we're seeing what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. No one wants that. But we need to recognise the competition is there, which is why we can't afford to, on the Solomons, the advice was there from at least last August. The foreign minister didn't go.
Well, that's contested, to be clear. But would a Chinese military base be a red line?
The government have said they have known for months. The government has said that.
Yeah, not since August last year. Would it be a red line for you for the Chinese to build a military base there?
Certainly, that would be unacceptable, and we need to make sure.
How would you stop it?
Well, we need to make sure that we engage with the Solomons. We've announced a considerable and detailed Pacific policy that goes to a range of measures.
Do you think it's going to stop this base that you say is unacceptable?
I think if we build... Australia has been, since the Second World War, the preferred security partner in the Pacific. That has been the case for all of those decades since the Second World War. What happened here is that we've had a dropping of the ball. We had cuts to foreign aid. We had a failure to take seriously the issue
but what happens
of
now?
climate change.
If it looks like a base is going to be built there, what do you do as Prime Minister?
Well, the objective will be, David, to stop that happening.
How?
To stop that happening through the programs and policies that we've put forward by engaging. How is it that the current Prime Minister still hasn't picked up the phone to the Prime Minister of the Solomons?
Okay. Let's get to our final question tonight, and it comes from Charles Ballog.
Good evening, Mr Albanese. With the increasing likelihood of a hung parliament, what is you and your party most likely to compromise on to achieve confidence and supply?
I'm the only person, thanks for the question, I'm the only person running for Prime Minister who's seeking to form government in their own right. We already have a coalition government with Scott Morrison and Barnaby Joyce. You won't see them together during the campaign. They haven't been together yet. And I predict that they're in Rockhampton
Maybe questions
the other
about
day.
what you might do, Anthony Albanese.
We're seeking 76 seats and a mandate for our policies. Our policies that don't have to be negotiated with junior partners or anyone else.
Charles's question is if you don't get there, right? If there's a hung parliament is his question. What are you willing to compromise?
My objective is to get there.
I appreciate that, but what do you do if you don't?
Well, we won't be doing deals. We won't be compromising. We will have a very clear position going forward.
So let me put this to you.
Of a National Anti-Corruption Commission.
The Teal Independents, as they're known, are calling for a target of 60% lower emissions by 2030. Are you willing to budge on that?
No, because what we didn't come up with a figure and then work out how to get there. What we did was the opposite. We worked out what's a good policy. What happens if you fix electricity transmission so that renewables can fit into the grid? What happens if you shift towards and encourage the take-up of electric vehicles? What happens if you have new industries that support cleaner energy? What happens if you have community batteries and extend the use of
And what happens if they
renewables?
say that's not enough? You won't budge
Well,
at all?
they will have a choice between a Labor government that's fair income about taking on the opportunities that are there from climate change and a government that has Angus Taylor as its minister, Scott Morrison, who has never taken these issues seriously. They will have a choice. We have a clear position on that. We have a clear position on a strong National Anti-Corruption Commission, and we have a clear position when it comes to the Respect at Work report about women's safety at work. We'll adopt all 55 recommendations.
Okay,
we'll
so
have a serious policy about all of those issues.
So do you expect they'll back you?
I'm concerned about getting Labor members elected to the Parliament.
But do you expect they'll back you, given what you've just said?
I expect that I will campaign for the next 2 weeks to make sure that Australia has the certainty of a majority Labor government with 76 members at least in the House of Representatives.
And are you confident you'll get there?
Well, if I'm in that position, it's up to the Australian people.
What do you think, though? Are you confident right now? 2.5 weeks to go.
It's up to the Australian people. At the beginning of the process, when I became Labor leader, my objective was for us to be competitive. We're at least that, David. We're at least that. And we're in a position, I think, whereby we have a clear, coherent plan for a better future, or you can have just more of the same. Governments don't get better in their 4th term in general, and you have nothing says nothing says the law of diminishing returns quite like Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government.
All right. That is all we have time for tonight. Please thank our guest, Anthony Albanese.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your questions, and to you at home for joining the conversation and streaming us on iView. Now, Prime Minister, if you are watching, the invitation still stands here on Q&A. Next week, Stan Grant will be with you live from Sydney. He'll be joined by an audience of undecided voters. And among those on the panel, Communications Minister Paul Fletcher and Shadow Innovation Minister Ed Husic. And Vicar and Linda will perform live
Unless Scott
as well.
takes up the offer.
Well, the offer is still there. Now it's over to Sammy J, accompanied by cellist Richard Vaudry. And a warning, this performance does contain some coarse and colourful language and should most certainly not be taken as a guide on how to vote. Here's the one and only Sammy J.
I wish I lived in a marginal seat, then my vote would actually count. I wish I lived in a marginal seat, then I could control the amount of swings that occur at every election in either direction. Don't care who wins, just give me a say. But my seat doesn't sway, so I might as well draw a penis or a vagina. I guess I'll decide on the day. They're both very strong candidates. I'm always torn, it's a difficult choice, but one must be drawn as I stand in the booth. It's my moment of truth, but deep down a sadness remains, 'cause I wish I had lived in a marginal seat. Then I could discuss education. I wish I lived in a marginal seat, where my preference affected the nation. But as it is, I'm a bystander watching the voters of Eden Monero expressing their views, while I'm left to choose if I'll be drawing a penis or a vagina. That's the biggest decision I face. And how many cocks will I draw in my box? If I draw a box, will I have enough space? Do I colour it in? Will I run out of time? Do I draw my Senate cocks under the line? Will I draw my willy in pencil or pen? If I cock up my dick, can I draw it again? Sing it, Albo! One day I'll move to a marginal seat. Then finally I will have power. I can vote for the parties instead of ignoring them. Number the dicks instead of just drawing them. Bring us Australia closer to thee. We draw genitalia 'cause we long to be safe in a marginal seat.